Realistically, what happens to the US if we withdraw from NATO? Story 1: The United States becomes a pariah that can no longer claim a leadership role in the free world. Its foreign policies, treaties and allegiances are all suspect and untrustworthy. The full faith and credit of the nation is diminished substantially if not completely destroyed. BTW, the only time NATO Article 5 was invoked was to protect and avenge the United States after 9/11, so basically the US is being a complete to its allies. Story 2: The US starts to lose military bases all over that enabled them to spread their power without actually using it. Military cutbacks will be necessary because there won't be need for both manpower and various capabilities. Any soft power or power by the implication that the US can reach almost any target at any time globally will be gone. Replaced by isolationism and economic issues, the military-industrial complex will pretty much crash and burn in the medium term and will struggle to market to foreigners that now want to build up their militaries, but every military sale having to be approved by the government and Congress is not going to be appealing for customers. Story 3: Pulling out of NATO makes America weaker by eroding our influence. If the US pulls out of NATO, countries will find a new leader. When they find a new leader, their energy and resources are diverted from the former leader to strengthen the new leader. America voted to step down from this leadership role. Many Americans disagree with that decision, but it's a decision that's been made. Germany, the UK, Australia, Japan, they will all be shifting in some ways. Even if you're not a NATO country, you will be looking to build ties with the new NATO leader. Story 4: Back in 2023, Congress passed a bill preventing a president from unilaterally withdrawing without the Senate or Congress, so I'm hoping there are people who have some common sense and prevent that from happening. Story 5: We cement our status as a country that can no longer be counted on to support our allies. If we still have allies, that is. We will likely lose visa-free travel to many of our old allies, limit our access to intelligence from said old allies, and most importantly cede Taiwan and all its chips to China, as they will now understand without question that we want to defend Taiwan. Those are just the immediate changes. Longer term, the dollar will become just another currency, and we won't be able to sell our bonds and T-bills to other countries as they want trust well pay them back, nor will we be seen as the ultimate safe haven. I'm only scratching the surface. Story 6: We begin our accelerating long slide into isolationism and irrelevancy. If we drop out of NATO, it's not clear to me that the dollar remains the global reserve currency. If it isn't, then everyone will start demanding repayment on our debt. This weakens our economy, and if we lose trading partners, everything becomes much more expensive. At which point inequality will become massive. It's not a good idea, IMO. Story 7: Economic impact. Because NATO provides a structure where the US shares defense burdens with its allies. If the US withdraws, Europe would likely have to significantly increase defense spending, which could create economic instability in some countries but might also lead to greater defense industry growth in Europe. Story 8: How hardly anyone is talking about this. What matters isn't our allies or our military bases or whatever it's our currency. The US dollar is only worth jack because people trust the US enough to constantly buy our treasury bills. You know what happens if we're forced to make good on all the debt we've accumulated? We are broke. Americans have this wide-eyed bullshit optimism that somehow we're immune to the same forces that up other countries, but there is absolutely all that distinguishes us from the likes of Venezuela and Zimbabwe apart from the dollar's influence. Without that, the US will experience an economic crisis unlike anything the world has ever seen. That is the real thing to worry about, and is why I urge all Americans regardless of your situation to look for a way out of the country. Anywhere will be better than the US if what I'm talking about comes to pass. Edit: something I didn't think I had to mention but apparently isn't obvious. I'm not saying that everyone else in this situation doesn't matter. The post specified what will happen to the US, so I answered from a US-focused POV. It's not American of me. It's answering the question as it was asked. Feels like this is America's version of Brexit, but much worse. Story 9: Since his first visit to Russia in 1987, the Russians have been buttering Trump up and convincing him that NATO is against US interests. It isn't been a huge factor in world stability where the US has been dominant culturally and economically. But Putin wants to re-establish Russian control over Eastern Europe, and the best way to do this is to get Trump to destroy NATO. At this point, Trump has been receiving decades of personal influence pushing him to see NATO as bad for the US and will do everything in his power to break it. If he succeeds, the US will be weakened and Russia and mainly China will become stronger. The GOP could stop him, but they know that if they do, the Republican Party will implode and Democrats will take over, and they'd rather watch the country collapse than let the Democrats win. The Republican Party, I don't know, my friend. The only thing I know after this month is that I will never trust the United States of America ever again in my life. You did a lot of crazy and questionable stuff throughout the years, but backstabbing the allies that died for you in your silly wars in the Middle East, this is far beyond treason and evil. Story 10: If the US withdraws from NATO, then the US loses a huge chunk of foreign influence, with nothing positive gained from the trade. The current US administration keeps talking about NATO as if it were a bad deal for them, when in reality it's an incredibly good deal. In exchange for having troops stationed in Europe and an excuse to keep the US military constantly up to date and modernized, the US has been able to wage constant global wars furthering its interests for the past 80 years without being considered the truly evil bad guy or being sanctioned by the world for it. Notice how both what the US gives and takes from NATO are both good for the US itself. The US was even able to call on European troops to help in its wars, and has preferential treatment in the EU economy, which is the world's largest single market over China. Military bases provide influence, and influence provides better economical deals. It's soft power 101, and the US withdrawing from the world will just give their rivals an opportunity to earn more money at the US's expense, without having to fire a single shot. Defending democracy in Europe is also one of the major factors that gave the US the moral high ground of being the righteous nation globally in the first place. Without that moral high ground, why should we not all economically sanction the US when they inevitably start their next war? And why shouldn't we all trade 10x more with China instead of the US? China's pretty bad, but how much longer is the world going to believe that the US is better? Having Europe reliant on the US for defense also means that the US can request special economical favors and deals. Giving that up means you're giving up leverage over Europe. If the US abandons Europe, 20 years from now Europe will possibly be trading way more with China than it is now, and the US government will be pulling the surprised Pikachu face and acting all insulted, but ultimately, will no longer have the influence in Europe to prevent it. If the US forces Europe to learn to stand on its own, then ultimately Europe will be able to do that, and the incentives to heed the US's geopolitical wishes will diminish. And no, the US can't then just do the typical US thing of bombing a region, Europe in this case, to get what it wants, because Europe has nukes too. That's why soft power is incredibly important. You get to steer things in the world towards your preferred outcome without first having to conquer anyone. That's pretty overpowered in a nuclear deterrent world where conquering is sometimes not even an option. Giving up all that soft power that you alone hold over the largest single market in the entire world is akin to attempting to win a chess match for global power against China by giving up your queen before the game has even started, and doing so in exchange for nothing. Art of the deal. My Story 11. From my perspective here in the UK, I would say that the entire idea of America as leader of the free world ends, arguably, it already has with the absolutely sickening display in the Oval Office. The USA simply cannot ever be trusted, in any dealing military or financial, if its participation in anything. The UN, NATO, WHO, WTO, all of these organizations which exist purely for the reason of pursuing a world based on the rule of law is subject to being completely appended and destroyed every 4 years on the basis of a coin toss between democracy and tyranny. Trump is using the office of president as a personal grudge-settling mechanism. What sane country would ever enter into a treaty or alliance with a country which allowed this ludicrous personal abuse of the highest office of state? Story 12. You lose the dollar. Being the world reserve currency, you suffer hyperinflation through the wazoo, because the amount of currency you printed and supplied to the rest of the world suddenly starts flooding back as noon wants it anymore. Everyone wants to sell the dollar and noon wants to buy it. All the things you import increase massively in price, because why would other countries let you buy in the dollar? It's now worthless to them. China and BRICS actually become a credible currency. Reserve. World War III, I guess. Story 13. It loses pretty much all of its military capacity because the USA's primary strength is the base network it has around the world and its ability to move assets all over the world. They can launch attacks on the Middle East because they can be supplied by NATO partners. They can launch strikes in China because they have bases and supply depots that can support them in Japan, not NATO. I know the more it turns against its allies and becomes America first, everyone else, the more America becomes limited to only operating within range of the USA itself. The greatest irony is that NATO is basically America's personal military alliance with the USA at its head. It is immensely beneficial to be the leading and dominating member of a huge military alliance like that. China and Russia would happily be the head of a NATO equivalent in their own regions. It's basically the emperor complaining that he has to wear a crown and live in a palace. Story 14. If the US withdraws from NATO, it could weaken the alliance's collective defense and influence on global security. It might lead to greater uncertainty in international relations, diminished cooperation on defense, and possibly embolden adversaries. The US would also lose a key platform for diplomatic and military collaboration with Europe. Story 15. We would lose access to a lot of military bases, limiting our global reach. Defense-wise we would be mostly okay though. Geographically speaking, it's difficult to mount a military invasion on the US. No single nation has the capability to get here in any meaningful numbers. Story 16. Would likely lose their logistics network in Europe, as I don't imagine Europe will want US bases on their soil if they aren't going to help defend. The betrayal would leave Europe less likely to assist the US, as already seen with a US Navy vessel being refused fuel in Norway. US force projection would become considerably hampered. US would be much more vulnerable to attack as any possible frontline moves from Europe to the US coastline, especially with the GIUK gap being weaker or outright undefended, would also leave US more vulnerable from Asia, as Europe would no longer be required to help defend America or its interests. Story 17. The USD quits being the global standard and Trump officially spins us into the worst economic downturn in a century. We would lose our influence, militarily and economically. We would lose our ability to see and airlift our military around the world in a moment's notice. We would quickly lose our superpower status. It would be historic though. Trump would 100 go down in history books. Story 18. The US is going to openly align Russia-China before Trump leaves office. It will be an axis of powers that don't work together to annex territories for their own benefits but agree to look the other way while they all do it. The other nations of the world will build up military capabilities including nuclear proliferation for deterrence and aggression. Smaller rogue nations will take the cue that borders can be moved by force and will begin their own campaigns to expand. The dollar will cease to be the default international currency, but nations will not agree on another, destroying international trade, unless we revere course the world is headed for major international conflict, potential nuclear annihilation. Story 19. The entire world would probably move more quickly to BRICS for sure. US credit would probably be downgraded. Countries could call their debts. All of this because the US would no longer be trusted by anyone. Countries would divest from the dollar as the world reserve currency. Couple quick points here. The US gave security assurances to Ukraine under Clinton, which is the reason Ukraine denuclearized. So we put them in a weaker position. Then when they needed us, all we did is send them money and guns and say good luck. Second, the one-time Article V was called in NATO, it was to help the US after 9/11. So people acting like the EU doesn't have our back are ignorant of reality. Story 20. The US defense industry export market will collapse. Countries now know that Trump will use any means to threaten them, including withholding spare parts and technical support for any weapons they buy from us. What fool would willingly subject themselves to that? Story 21. I'm really curious to see how the Trump and Russia propaganda machines try to villainize Europe and NATO, who have never done anything to try to harm the US, and make Russia, China, and North Korea, who have actively tried to harm us for decades, seem like our long-lost best friends. Story 22. The US will lose all soft power in Asia and the Middle East. The former because none will trust US alliances and China at least honors its contracts. The latter because the US mainly projects power through Europe and logistics without it is just way too expensive. US military companies will lose most of their non-US business as NATO compliance is the most important attribute of military equipment of NATO countries. Story 23. US will be fine. US has big domestic market, big workforce, both high skill and manual labor, plenty natural resources and farmland, big industrial output. Economically, US is the only one that can go the isolationist route. Not saying this is the best way, I mean having friends and trading partners is always better, but it's not a doomsday either. About defense, US has thousands of nukes, 2 big oceans on both sides, 11 aircraft carriers, strategic bombers that can deliver ordnance 5,000 kilometers away. Historically, I only remember 2 entities that dared to attack US unprovoked: Nazi Japan and Al-Qaeda. Let's just say both of them didn't end well, for US citizens. I dare say traffic accidents and mass shootings are bigger safety hazards compared to a foreign invasion. Story 24. US exceptionalism is and always has been a myth, but what it had note past tense is soft power, and the respect of people around the world deserved or not, but it has chosen to squander that power, be it with Ukraine actions, sovereignty impingement threats, dismantling of USAID, tariffs and isolationism, etc. Yes, it's a strong nation, but its slide off the world stage as a respected influencer is accelerating. US soft power was always more of an influence than its hard power. It may continue to demand respect, but will not be able to command respect in the foreseeable future. Story 25. The way the US projects power and protects trade channels is through friendly nations and forging friendships. Leaving our primary military alliance would damage the rules-based order we built after the Second World War. It would also leave our trade channels extremely vulnerable. Our ability to project soft or hard power would be severely diminished. It would honestly probably usher in a period of neo-colonialism in the vacuum left behind. We would also be much less wealthy in the following decades. But a few self-interested people would probably get really rich facilitating that exit for foreign powers that would really like to see the end of US hegemony. Story 26. As a rough idea, European countries pivot to a war economy to support Ukraine, prevent further Russian expansion, which, e.g., Poland and Finland are very wary of, as well as to diversify from Russian energy. As a result, spending on US defense transfers to European companies, BAE Systems from the UK, Airbus from the Dutch America, either continues with its foreign tariffs, in which case anything from outside the USA gets more expensive, or they seek new trade partnerships with other nations. If one of those other nations is Russia, the cycle continues and gets worse. No matter what, it doesn't bode well for Americans, unless Russia becomes able to buy US weaponry, at which point we basically have WWII, at which point most European countries will evict any US military bases personnel, if the average American realizes how they are. You have an insane amount of farming space and natural resources, but also a government completely unwilling to face legitimate threats like climate change. You have an insane ability to ramp up production, but get something like 90 of your potash fertilizer from Canada, who your president keeps threatening. The USA in 1900 could keep everyone fed and employed by devoting entire city-states to that purpose. But it's 2025 now, and a lot of your manufacturing has been overseas for decades. The companies have moved, the staff have left, the skills take time to teach. You can't turn Detroit into a microchip production line overnight, and the government seems unwilling to invest in anything that might make that possible. Story 27. This is so tiring. The US isn't leaving NATO. Hey, race. A quote from the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth. When he visited NATO a few weeks ago, the United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe, full stop. What the US wants is for Europe to step up its defense spending. All this drama and fear-mongering you're seeing in the media is just a tactic to scare European policymakers into giving in to European leaders that go ahead to rise up the defense spending, and it's working. Story 28. Truthfully, not much in the short term. Russia is bogged down in Ukraine even without the US's support. Granted, eventual Russian victory there will be incredibly likely without US helping Ukraine, as the US makes up almost half of the aid to Ukraine, and Europe is in no position to make up the difference in the short term without actually deploying boots on the ground. However, Russia has paid a terrible price in men and more importantly for their ambitions equipment in Ukraine. Russia won't be making any big moves for a while. Long term though you would see a lot of instability. The world has seen an almost unprecedented period of peace, due in no small part thanks to US security guarantees. While Europe might be able to fend for itself containing Russian expansion into a US-less NATO, the real damage will be to US-Pacific allies. While Pacific alliances are separate from NATO, the US's lack of commitment to its greatest alliance will mean countries like China may be willing to bet on the US being non-committal. You would likely see conflict erupt between China and Taiwan, as well as more aggressive moves to claim disputed islands with the Philippines, Japan, and other non-nuclear states. The loss of Taiwan specifically and Asian conflicts generally will result in global supply shortages, price increases, and economic instability that will affect the globe. Story 29. Nothing. America's Navy defends the entire ocean to keep trade routes safe. We have the most powerful army and air force on the planet. Europe will be begging the US to return in a year. Story 30. If the US withdrew from NATO, trillions of dollars worth of tech and research becomes obsolete. What good is an F-35 when potential adversaries thanks to Trump knows all of its capabilities? Even worse, some spare parts may be from EU and Canada. If that were to happen, our entire military would need new equipment. Story 31. We lose the central pin of our international strategy. Since the end of WW2, we are immediately much weaker and much less able to project power across the globe. Story 32. Reddit likes to imagine that America would become a weak, irrelevant country, but in reality, NATO would likely collapse, which could end up strengthening the US. Instead, look at the League of Nations. America refused to join for the same reasons it might leave NATO today, and because the US stayed out, the League was ineffective, leading to World War II. Post-WW2, America is the strongest country in the world. History has already played this exact scenario out. There's nothing to ponder. Story 33. Nothing. Strongly believe nothing will happen. People screaming about Russia and China. Nah, Russia is struggling with Ukraine. Ukraine has only received help via older equipment and money. China ain't gonna do. China is one of the most prosperous nations ATM, and they kinda just stay to themselves. While giving the evil eye to Taiwan, the other countries in NATO will also be fine. Shit's just being overly exaggerated. Story 34. The US leaving NATO would be like pulling the keystone from an arch. Things wouldn't collapse overnight, but cracks would start forming fast. Europe scrambles, Russia gets bold, and America suddenly feels a lot. Story 35. Let's be completely honest. NATO exists to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. Decades ago, that was a big issue when it was the Warsaw Pact. Nowadays, it's basically just Russia. They normally have a 90% or so defense budget. The EU could easily double that without breaking a sweat. They just need to use the money wisely and put troops right on the border. 2% of GDP for Europe is like 400 billion. Russia could never match that. This would all be over, and the US, if it was a rational world actor, which it currently is not, would be free to back up the Asian countries against China and patrol the world shipping lanes to keep trade flowing. In the short term, Europe has serious gaps in their capability that it's going to take them years to fix. Hopefully Russia is so harmed from Ukraine, they don't have the resources to exploit that. Story 36. Massive nuclear proliferation. France, UK already have and probably build more nukes. Poland and Germany might follow. More chances someone actually uses them. Russia rebuilds its forces, starts threatening and destabilizing the Baltic's tiny countries. All maybe tries to take a bite out of one of them. Dares the rest of NATO to step in. Maybe a hot war in EU, which would absolutely tank the global economy. Economically, no one has benefited by the post-WWI international, global security order more than the USA. Leave NATO and you give up getting to set the rules of the game to benefit yourself. Both as the general global economy slows from increased distrust, uncertainty, war, etc., and specifically as USA stops being able to set the terms to benefit itself, stability and a protected rules-based order with our trade partners benefit us. Leaving NATO harms that. There's a reason why decades of Republicans have been all in on NATO, WTO, etc., etc. It's absolutely great for capital business. Story 37. You'll get billions of dollars. I'm telling you, billions of dollars. Trillions. You'll be billionaires. Money. You'll be able to spend your vacations in Siberia, hunt bears, and China will eat out of your hands. Story 38. If the US abandons Ukraine and pulls out of NATO, then there is a high chance Trump is aligning us with the new axis of evil. After Putin takes his spoils of war, hell, take Moldova, Belarus, Transnistria, Georgia, then his war machine, with the backing of Iran, North Korea, and the US, he will begin probing NATO countries. What happens next depends on who wins WW3, but no matter the outcome, it won't be better than staying in NATO. Story 39. People in this thread are vastly overestimating the influence of every other country outside the US that is in NATO. Not much will change, to be honest. It's the most obvious outcome, Occam's razor. The US is too large of a market with too much influence at a global scale. Pulling out would force people to engage, while just doing nothing lets people diversify over time. Pulling out is the strong play negotiation-wise and will result in most countries crawling on hands and knees to be back involved with the US. It's the obvious take economically, even if it sounds harsh. Story 40. US leaves NATO and they instantly lose a ton of diplomatic leverage, no longer considered leaders in the free world, and instantly lose the majority of their credibility. US dollar devalues and is no longer the standard that currencies are traded against. Basically, anyone with half a brain knows it's the worst possible thing they could do to themselves. Story 41. The US will become completely irrelevant. If nobody is reliant on America policing the world, and Trump tears up every trade agreement, why would anyone keep using American dollars? Once everyone finishes dumping the greenback, it will become apparent how incredibly worthless that currency is. The world will move on, likely a split between the euro and whatever coin BRICS comes up with. America will no longer be able to buy boatloads of goods for dirt cheap. They will decline into a second-rate power, just as Putin intended. Story 42. Let's talk realpolitik. The US isn't just in NATO. It is to all intents and purposes in charge of NATO. It has more troops, more equipment, more experience. It enables the US to place strategically important military bases all over Europe at marginal cost to itself. It is, in short, a tool for furthering US foreign interests. The same could be said for the whole rules-based world order. All of these things were set up by Americans for their country's own benefit. The Americans who did this were not fools and may have used idealistic language, but the institutions continued because they served their purposes extremely well. Leaving NATO is ceding influence on the most strategic pieces of soil outside of the continental US. It also raises the possibility of a repeat of the scenario of the two world wars where the US initially tried to stay out of a European war only to get dragged in anyway. One of the purposes of NATO has always been to prevent that happening by guaranteeing a swift US response. Story 43. We probably stop getting intel from our former allies about terrorist activities. We lose reciprocity for criminal law enforcement. We may start getting economic sanctions, but it's not as directly correlated. Story 44 makes WW3 that much closer. US defense of Europe ties Putin's hands. Without the US, a war between Europe and Russia becomes extremely realistic. Not that Biden's handling of Ukraine was perfect, but it was effectively boxing Putin in and on the cheap. Let's see how the MAGA shits complain about $100 billion when we either lose all our economic partners sending us into depression, or we have to liberate Europe again with our own blood and more money than you can imagine. Story 45. Well, the US and Europe become separate military blocs. Economically, we will lose the advantage of specialization. BC Europe now needs to build parallel military and intelligence structures from us. The IT sector in the US enjoys essentially a monopoly position at the moment. This will eventually go away as Europe panics to develop its own systems. That's going to impact the US economy heavily. You lose the ability to guarantee Europe sides with you in future conflicts. Europe trades a lot more with China these days. It's entirely possible that when you try to rally the world against China or blockade them in some hypothetical war, rump NATO may not assist, or could even undermine your efforts. Diplomatically, you may also find European nations just shared intel less and are generally less inclined to support you getting your way in future international relations. Finally, with the European bloc being a little unstable, you may find NATO continues to crumble further, until the rump alliance actually finds itself at war with an emboldened Russia, effectively destroying the world economy as the breadbaskets of Europe demolish each other. Story 46. You basically become a country like China or Russia, a superpower without friends, those friends that, even with all their faults, bend it over backwards to please you, and who sacrificed lives to support you. Story 47. My guess would be that our members of NATO will ask for the removal of military bases in their country. This will limit the global reach the US has. Countries that the US loans through will pull financial support. This will diminish the value of the dollar and drive costs up. Story 48. We might get to spend our tax money on some of those nice things the Europeans have been spending their money on for decades. We might actually see a rise in the standard of living instead of subsidizing Europe's. Story 49. We would stand alone. NATO are allies we stuck with after World War II. The Earth will basically become a three-ring circus with US, China and Russia seeking dominance. I wish I were 50 years into the future so I could look back on this time period and see how it played out. Story 50. It would have to be through a supermajority in the Senate or congressional action. Congress was worried about this and passed a law to prevent it from happening. Not to say that Congress Republican majority won't just rubber stamp a bill to withdraw anyway, but the president can't unilaterally withdraw the U.S. 22 U.S.C. 1948 F. Story 51. If we no longer need to help defend other countries, then we bring all our troops around the world home and slash the military and defense budget by half. Millions in the defense industry would lose their jobs and communities would collapse, but hey, who cares? Story 52. The only time that Article 5 of NATO has been used was after 9/11, and all of the NATO allies stepped up and helped the US fight in Afghanistan. Tens of billions spent by allies and many lost lives to help defend their American ally. drop out of NATO and you are on your own. Also, you lose NATO bases for force projection, and Europe will have no reason to deal with the BS from the large US tech companies, and those companies will lose their second largest market. Listing just 3 NATO counties, Canada spent $18 billion in Afghanistan, the UK spent $30 billion, Germany $19 billion plus smaller contributions from other NATO partners. The UK also spent $18 billion in Iraq. Story 53. Russia will start making threats towards Europe. They'll start talking about liberating Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, because Russian speakers are suppressed. Story 54. USA has a very, very soft underbelly of very low security, easily breached essential infrastructure targets. Homeland Security and national intel agencies are now in the hands of Trump loyalists, Putin sympathizers, suspected Russia assets and people completely unqualified for the roles there, and you'll be on your own when Putin figures the time is ripe for an attack, or China, or ISIS, or any one of a number of enemies lying in wait. And don't forget, any such attack likely won't be military in nature, but cyber. The old adage united we stand, divided we fall comes to mind. Even with Trump making statements that Europe should not rely on USA coming to their aid if attacked might be enough for European nations to return the favor, I think if USA were attacked today, Canada especially would be very, very reluctant to help. Story 55. 4 main things. 1. Weakening of the U.S. military-industrial complex, including a significant loss of income for a wide range of U.S. workers. Most of NATO buys American weapons. Those weapons are designed and manufactured mostly in the U.S. for security reasons. Europe and Canada not buying those weapons means that there is less demand for them, which in turn means fewer manufacturing and design jobs in the U.S. Also, these foreign purchases help support weapons development, so the U.S. will have less money to develop new weapons and will likely be replaced with the EU spinning up their own weapons research, meaning that the U.S. loses a huge edge it has in weapons technology. 2. Loss of overseas military bases. The U.S. has over 40 bases in Europe, including medical centers, resupply bases, logistical centers, and so on. If the U.S. leaves NATO, European countries will almost certainly cut permission to be there, which means bringing home all of the people and hopefully supplies. It's taken decades to supply those bases, not all of them will make it back that are there. 3. Loss of the ability to project power. We're already seeing this, with Norway refusing to resupply a U.S. submarine, but if Europe also kicks the U.S. out of Europe, it's going to be a lot harder for the U.S. to go through the Mediterranean to get to the Middle East, and the U.S. doesn't have the infrastructure in place to go around Africa. Which could mean that the U.S. is incapable of doing anything in Eastern Europe, anywhere in Africa not in range of the Atlantic coast, and the Middle East through India. For loss of political power, the U.S. has for a long time been able to direct international diplomacy by leveraging its role in NATO as the protector of Europe, and kind of the world. This started to fall apart in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, which was opposed by multiple European nations, but has still paid out for the U.S. since then. However, without Europe and Canada's support, and especially if the EU and Canada form their own military treaty that can offer the same military support that the U.S. can, especially to areas in Africa and the Middle East. C.3, the U.S. loses its ability to influence foreign governments. If you're Saudi Arabia, and you're given a choice between the U.S. and NATO minus the U.S., it might just be better to be allies with NATO minus the U.S., because they're closer and so can help you more. Story 56. NATO has 32 members. They all agree to assist each other if attacked. There are 195 countries in the world. If the U.S. leaves NATO and another country attacks the U.S., we're on our own. If a whole bunch of countries attack the U.S., we're on our own. Is that what we the people want? Lunacy. We stop sending the money, they complain. Story 57. The rest of NATO can change the reserve currency and start dumping U.S. Treasury bonds. Japan and China have already dumped huge sums of U.S. Treasury bonds to secure their own economies. The U.S. dollar has no real tangible value outside of the social contracts we've been able to cultivate. Once those social contracts are broken, so too will the American economy. We're looking at the possibility of an economic collapse worse than the Great Depression if that happens. Story 58. It will accelerate America's imperial decline, but the U.S. never really needed NATO for self-defense, so the average American will barely notice a difference in their daily lives. Europeans, on the other hand, just got stabbed in the back and will have to make a lot of tough decisions about how to move forward without the United States. In the long run, they might emerge stronger and more unified, but it's not inevitable, and in the short term it's going to cause a lot of chaos and confusion. China and Russia will continue working together because the U.S. is way too unstable for Putin to risk alienating China. Overall, things get worse for Western countries, but probably stay the same or even improve for the rest of the world. Story 59. You lose a significant amount of global influence. The reason that the U.S. has been able to exert such influence over Europe, excluding the East prior to 1990 obs over the last 70 years or so, is because Europe has been reliant on the U.S. for protection. If Europe is left to fend for itself, why would Europe continue to buy U.S. equipment if interoperability with U.S. forces was no longer important, and where there'd be concern about the U.S. meddling in how that equipment was used? Why would Europe continue to make concessions in other spheres economically, technologically, etc. if there's no longer a risk of U.S. disengagement because the U.S. has already disengaged? Why would Europe continue to align to U.S. interests in the Middle East, Africa, or Asia? sometimes to its own detriment, if it no longer believes in the broader edifice of the West. And of course, if Europe suddenly needs to rearm and focus on its defense, it's likely to look at ways of raising revenue. If the US is economically unreliable and capricious and besides that resented, Europe will look for partnerships elsewhere, to China, to India, to various other places, some of which will be to the US's disadvantage.